Good evening. Thank you all for coming out this evening, for coming together, spending time here at the church. I'm sorry I'm not with you. As many of you know, my mom has Alzheimer's. I told you that she'd been diagnosed just shortly after I agreed to come here to the church. Just recently, she's also been diagnosed with Lewy body dementia, which is kind of another form of Alzheimer's, but tends to deteriorate more rapidly, and the two together certainly even more so. And she's been struggling lately. Just a few weeks ago, she was with my sister. They'd been together all day, and at the end of the day, she said to my sister, "I've been wanting to ask you all day, do you have any siblings?" So she's starting to forget some of us. I can tell when I talk to her that she's forgetting my kids. She's getting confused about who's who and so forth. So the vestry was gracious enough to encourage me to take the time. This week is spring break for the kids, and so we've all headed up to North Carolina to spend a little time with my mom and just, take advantage of what time we have left. So, with that, this evening you are going to be following along to this video. We're going to be talking about evangelism, and the book that we have for this study is What is Evangelism? Now, the information on where you can order that is in the Canterbury Tales. That you can get it straight from Amazon. It'll be here in just a day or two. But you're certainly not required to have this book in order to participate. But before we really get started, I want you to take about 5 minutes to talk about what is evangelism. Now, I don't want you to talk about your feelings about evangelism or experiences you've had or the way other people do it or any of that. I want you to simply talk about what constitutes evangelism. So go ahead and take about 5 minutes. So I've been an Episcopalian all my life, and I've been leading these conversations for 20 plus years about what it means to evangelize in the context of the Episcopal Church. And so I know for a fact that many of you are uncomfortable with this very conversation. Even talking about it makes you uncomfortable. But when we talk about evangelism, I suspect many of you talked about living your life in such a way that people are drawn to you and to Christ through your very being. Well, I think that's a wonderful notion. I, for one, don't think I can pull that off. I don't think I can be so joyous, so fetching, so kind and loving that people are going to simply look at my life and say, wow, what does he have that I don't have? I just don't see myself pulling that off. And some of you, I suspect when we talk about this, I bet somebody here quoted Francis of Assisi, who says, "Preach the gospel at all times, using words only when necessary." Now, for what it's worth, no one in history has been able to directly attribute that quote to him. There's nowhere that shows that he wrote it. None of his contemporaries contribute that quote to him. That only comes much later on in history that gets attributed to him. So when we talk about what is evangelism, the word itself means to preach. To share the good news. It means to talk to people. Talking to others about God is a necessary part of evangelism. Certainly living our lives in a way that draw people to us or to God is a wonderful thing. That kind of gets our foot in the door, gives us the opportunity. But ultimately evangelism has to include speaking. But there's good news, and we're going to talk about what that good news is as we move forward. But I want us to take another break again, and just around your tables once again, I want you to talk about your concerns about evangelism. Why is it scary or troubling? Or what is it that bothers you about the idea of evangelism or how it's been done to you in the past? So let's have a 10-minute or so conversation around that. So I certainly understand that many of you, in talking about evangelism, probably had some stories of times when it had been done to you or to others that made people uncomfortable, that turned them off. And I, of course, don't ever want to see that happen. But ultimately, evangelism is just about telling our story. So the first step in evangelism is to be in relationship with others. You know, it can be kind of the preacher on the street corner. I certainly admire someone who can and will do that. It can be that person who knocks on the door, but more often than not, it's about relationships that you already have in your life, friends, family, people that have grown close to you and that you find yourself in a position to speak truth to. And that's so important, that you're in a position to speak some truth, to tell them about God. And ultimately, it's about telling your story of how God has done a work in your life, how God makes a difference in your life, how your faith changes the way you see the world, how, as God says, it sets us apart from the world, so that our priorities, our worries, our things are not the same as all the people of the world. That's what evangelism is at its best, and I'd say at its most common. It's between people who already know each other, people who love each other. It's telling your story. But when we talk about this idea of evangelism, it's also a fundamental question of how we see our faith. You see, if we're going to choose to evangelize or not says something about how we view God. Because if we say, well, you know, I appreciate church, I like the scriptures, I'm thankful I can pray, I'm glad for what God does for me, but I don't want to tell anybody else about it, then in some ways we've become a consumer who is simply here to be fed, but not to feed others. And I think instinctively when I say it that way, and perhaps I'm phrasing it in a way that's a little leading there, but instinctively we know that that's not what we're called to do. We are called to share the love, to share the faith, to share the good things that God has poured out into our lives with others. And so that's really what evangelism is. It's recognizing the gift we've received and being willing to share it with another in need. And need takes all sorts of forms. We talk about people being hungry, people being lonely, people being scared. And all those needs are good, and we should strive to meet those needs. But people also have a need to have purpose, to have understanding, to know that there's a reason that they're here, and that whatever's going on in this crazy world we live in doesn't trump the truth of their creation, of their being here for a reason. And that's a piece of what we have to offer the world that no social services could ever fill. It's an understanding of who we are, of whose we are, and of why we're here. So I want to remind you, as I said earlier, evangelism is ultimately about sharing your story, a story that is personal to you. And so your homework for next week, because as we talk about this next week, I want you to have some context in which to discuss this. I want you all to think of a time when God was at work in your life, when God made a difference. Now that could be 50 years ago, could be 5 days ago. But think of a story where you feel like God was at work, or your faith allowed you to withstand something that you would have said, I'm not sure I could go through that. Or it gave you an insight into some aspect of your life or another's life that you realized, well, that maybe didn't come from me. That came from somewhere else. And this could be directly through prayer. You could tell us a story. You could think of a story where your life was changed somehow in your prayer life. It could be through study. It could be through service that you were doing for others. Or it could be through work that someone else has done for you. I think that's often the way that I find God working in my life is through others, through their words, through their encouragement, through their correction, through their pushing me into places I don't always want to go, or pushing me into places I need to go that maybe I really want to go, but I'm not willing in and of myself to do it. But I want to hear your stories, or be prepared to talk about your stories in a way that will be meaningful to you. So think through a story, and come ready to talk about it. Thank you all.